Yesterday, the Bexar County District Attorney's Office announced that the 3 SAPD officers who shot and killed Melissa Perez have all received felony indictments. The citizens serving on the grand jury considered all the evidence presented by the prosecutors, and they recommended that the following charges be brought. Sergeant Flores and Officer Alejandro were both charged with first-degree murder. Officer Villalobos was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. All of these are first-degree felonies. Now, the family is trying to heal, and they certainly applaud the seriousness with which the district attorney has taken this case, and they applaud these indictments. But honestly, the announcements of these indictments have caused the family to relive all of these events. It's caused them to have a tidal wave of emotion. So please keep the family in your thoughts and prayers as they suffer through this ordeal. Now, we're going to continue to learn more about what really happened on that terrible night as this process unfolds. But we already know a lot more than we did back in June. For example, we now know that the toxicology report shows that Ms. Perez did not have any illegal drugs in her system when she died. She wasn't having a drug overdose, she was having an acute schizophrenic episode. We also know that there were 15 SAPD officers on the scene, including several supervisors, yet none of them took any action to prevent this unjustified shooting. This could never have happened without a serious lack of training on the part of the policymakers at SAPD. We also know that at least 3 of the SAPD officers on the scene had already interacted with Ms. Perez previously. They knew that she was schizophrenic. Moreover, when the fire department got there, they asked Ms. Perez, have you been diagnosed with schizophrenia? And she told them yes. So the officers and the other first responders at the scene, they knew that Ms. Perez was having a schizophrenic episode and that she was cutting the wires to the fire alarm system because of her mental illness. But they still treated her like she was a dangerous criminal. We also know that Ms. Perez had barricaded at least one of the doors to her apartment with the furniture from inside the apartment. And we also know that the SAPD officers had tried unsuccessfully to kick in through the door throughout the night. So Ms. Perez was doing everything she could to distance herself from the officers. And no reasonable officer could have thought that Ms. Perez presented a danger to anyone. Finally, we know that more than once, officers on the scene can be heard on the body cam footage saying that if they're able to breach through the door and get into the apartment, they were not worried about the fact that Ms. Perez was carrying a hammer, meaning they didn't consider the hammer to be a threat. But now, these same officers are claiming that the hammer that she had behind a closed and locked door was such a danger to them that it was okay to shoot and kill her. It's these same officers who didn't call the mental health team. Now, the indictments against these individual officers is a good first step, but this cannot end with only the shooting officers being held accountable. And unfortunately, the city of San Antonio is attempting to wash its hands of this whole tragedy. They're taking the position that, well, these officers need to go to prison, but we didn't do anything wrong. Our training was perfect. Our protocols were perfect. We didn't do anything to contribute to this claim, and that cannot be true. In fact, the city is claiming that even though the officers were on the clock at the time, even though they were in full police uniform and were responding to dispatch, the city would have us believe that they were not even police officers at the time. They weren't even in the scope and course of their employment. Now, so much needs to be done to make sure that this never happens again. But nothing will change if the city is not honest about the glaring deficiencies in the police department that caused this to happen. For example, currently the mental health team does not respond to calls late at night. This needs to change. We know that Sergeant Flores and Officer Alejandro had engaged in several prior acts of police misconduct that were serious enough to recommend termination, but they were not adequately disciplined or trained and were put back on the street. Indeed, the failure to discipline Sergeant Flores and Officer Alejandro is part of a much larger pattern of ignoring police misconduct at SAPD. This needs to change. In this case, there were 15 different officers on the scene, and none of them did anything to intervene, which shows a serious lack of training. How could 15 different officers suddenly get amnesia when it comes to the training and the protocols? No, the problem is they weren't adequately trained. Otherwise, one of them would have stepped up and said, stand down, there's no danger here, put your pistol away. Now, regarding the use and the improper use of lethal force. The city has a long and well-documented history where its officers improperly used deadly force without any meaningful consequence to the officers. This is why this continues to happen, and it needs to change. But unfortunately, nothing is going to change until the city's elected officials accept responsibility for the actions of all 15 of the officers who were on duty and were at the scene at Ms. Perez's home on that horrible night. Only when the city accepts responsibility can the city start to improve, and only then can the family and the community heal.